Everyone talks about 1984, and for good reason. It is one of the most influential novels of the 20th century, and it paints a terrifying image of tyranny in its most absolute and all consuming form, with surveillance and propaganda and censorship and psychological domination, even the destruction of language itself. But Orwell's novel is not only, or really even the best book to understand the dystopian nightmare of the all powerful state. So today I want to take a look at 8 books that help me to better understand bureaucracy, conformity, state power, and the fragility of truth itself. And the first one here is probably the most psychologically terrifying of all of them. If 1984 is about external oppression, this book focuses far more on the essential component of any successful tyranny, which is that of internal surrender. The book is Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler, and it's loosely inspired by Stalin's purges and show trials, if you're familiar with that history. What happened was loyal revolutionaries would kind of publicly confess to these absurd crimes that they never committed, obviously never committed, and everyone knew it was a show. This has really now become kind of a textbook authoritarian action. It was also very common under Mao in communist China, for example. But what makes Darkness at Noon such a great exploration of the collectivist tyranny is really the way Kessler explores how, through manipulation, torture, and all these other effects, the state, in this really interesting way in this novel, is able to lead people not just to lie, but also to distrust truth, the idea of truth itself. So, like 1984, the Revolutionary Party in Darkness at Noon gradually weaves history through its own lens, which causes everything to eventually be subordinate to the party line. Kessler adeptly investigates how, in bending that history to the requirements of ideology, reality becomes negotiable, and the danger that happens with negotiable reality. So it's one of the deepest explorations of this kind of fanaticism that has ever been written, and I highly recommend reading Darkness at Noon. The second book to read to understand totalitarianism, which was the term that was coined by the Italian critics of Mussolini in the 1920s. They wanted to criticize this kind of unprecedented state control. Hannah Arendt also wrote a book called On Totalitarianism, kind of about that as well. But it takes even further step after Italian fascism. So generally what we mean when we think of totalitarianism is the total state control of every aspect of life, from actions to words, and as much as possible also thoughts, such as what we saw under Nazi Germany state or the Soviet Union state. Anyways, the second book kind of flips the script here, so it's actually written well before 1984 and well before Darkness at Noon, and it highlights the soft control aspect of totalitarianism rather than the hard control side, which is so often focused on. And I would argue this book is actually in many ways more accurate and relevant to our modern, consumer-driven, free, to do whatever you want world than, say, Darkness at Noon or 1984. And of course, speaking about Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. So this is a really good one. People often love to compare Huxley and Orwell, but they diagnose two different civilizational dangers, the two writers. Orwell talks a lot about the oppression through hard power, Huxley about the oppression through pleasure and influence and those more soft power components. The best way I can think of to illustrate this difference, using books of course, is that in 1984, there are all sorts of book bans and you can't get the books, you can't read the books, and restrictions, but in Brave New World, you can read whatever book you want, but nobody wants to read in the first place. So one of the greatest lines from this book, one that really encapsulates much of the message, comes from the antagonist, because antagonists are the best characters, right? I made another video on that, but that's for another time. And the quote is, "Universal happiness keeps the wheel steadily turning. Truth and beauty can't. Happiness has got to be paid for." That line gives me chills, but Huxley understood that a society can lose its freedom not only through violence, but also through comfort, distraction, consumerism, entertainment, and pacification of a number of different forms. This was a really great novel, and I highly recommend reading Brave New World, perhaps after reading The Tempest, which is where the title of the novel comes from. But anyways, it is very much worth reading if you're interested in exploring the power of total control through the opposite lens of soft power. Anyways, the third novel here is written by a famed Russian writer whose name I am likely to absolutely butcher here, so I apologize in advance. Denisovich, Mayatai? What? I believe that was terrible, man. I'm gonna really have to, if I'm gonna keep talking about books, I'm gonna have to learn Russian. Anyways, the third book here is We by Yevgeny Zamyatin, I believe. I believe that's how you pronounce it. Oh, really bad. Anyways, this is one of this is a great kind of forgotten dystopian novel. I remember first hearing about this in high school, but it took me a number of years to read it actually. And it's a great short book. It's really influential on these later dystopian writers that we already talked about in this dystopian totalitarian fiction area. And without this book, I'm not sure if we'd have Orwell or Huxley at all, or at least if we did have them, they would look so different. We really imagines this ultra rational society of the future where individuality is like a disease, and this hive mind is the correct way to be. So you can really see the influence on Huxley and Brave New World of just falling in line, that aspect. But the human beings do this by becoming almost these mathematical automatons, these units in this collective machine, which is much more kind of an influence on 1984. You can kind of see that aspect. So this book is terrifying in that it holds everything together through this kind of efficiency, really, and conformity more than anything else, more than any hard power. And the terrifying question that undergirds this book is, what if people surrender their freedom? Not because they're forced to surrender it. What if they just surrender it because they don't like the pressures and fears of individuality? And so that was another one that I highly recommend. We by the Russian guy. Anyways, moving swiftly along. The next book on my list here is another by Orwell. His much shorter and more polarizing book, which is Animal Farm. This is a great allegorical book about an animal uprising where the animals take the farm and the events that transpire in the wake of this revolution. Now, I'm not really sure that polarizing per se is the right word for this, but for whatever reason, most people I meet that talk about Animal Farm, they either really love it, some even preferring it to 1984, for example, or they really dislike it. So perhaps people kind of dismiss Animal Farm because they read it in high school, which is a mistake. I'm curious to see, though, if 1984 will be Orwell's most enduring political work. C.S. Lewis, interestingly, once suggested that 1984 would fade with time, and Animal Farm would continue to endure for many generations. I think he thought that because he was very much a lover of allegories. If you look at his Narnia series, he really thought that allegory ages better because it kind of captures this permanent aspect of human nature rather than responding to a political moment. But Tolkien famously criticized his Lewis on account of his approach to allegory, and I generally agree with Tolkien on this and prefer non-allegorical books most of the time, though not always. All held equal, I prefer not just reading a simple allegory where every character accords with a real person. It reduces it for me. I prefer something that's more dynamic. That's just my personal taste. But I'm also not entirely sure Lewis was right about 1984 kind of being a fad and fading. Clearly, it has endured enormously. If anything, its popularity has grown in the last 50 years. So, but Animal Farm definitely is not a simple allegory either, right? It is about Stalinism, of course, and that's pretty obvious. You can see characters that compare to very, very famous characters in the Russian Revolution, like Trotsky and Stalin and whatnot. But it is also about corruption, that kind of inherent corruption that all resentment-fueled revolutions have. So it famously shows how these noble ideas become slogans, and that language and power can be used to rewrite memory. And so I really think it's a wonderful look at the gradual arrival at tyranny, one step after another, one leap at a time. It also has one of the greatest last lines of any book, which I won't say here to spoil anything, but Animal Farm, it really is a great book to understand totalitarianism. Okay, now before we get to the last book, a couple of honorable mentions here. So Farenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, where Orwell feared truth being destroyed from above, from kind of corruption and totalitarian control. Bradbury really feared a society that would abandon it through distraction, entertainment, and intellectual comfort. And so his tyranny, again, is kind of a soft tyranny built not on force but apathy, right? Not reading books in the first place. Another one, Anthem by Ayn Rand. Now, whatever you think of Ayn Rand's philosophy, Anthem remains a striking portrait of collectivism taken to the extreme, which, is definitely what you would expect. It's even the word I disappears because genuine individuality is seen as completely threatening, inherently threatening to the system. And that's totally true when we look at any totalitarian system. They don't like individuals. Individuals are the biggest threat to a totalitarian system. Now, the third one is One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. This one draws from his experiences more than anything. Solzhenitsyn kind of strips this totalitarianism down, and he shows the daily reality of the kind of cold hunger, humiliation, bureaucracy that he experienced in his own imprisonment in Siberia, while reminding us kind of that in all of these systems, it's that line between good and evil that runs through every human heart that really matters, rather than this category of people are the bad people and this category of people are the good people. There are good and bad in everyone in these totalitarian systems, just like in life. There are good and bad in people of every walk of life. And so this is a really, really important reminder. And finally, the last book on our list here to understand bureaucratic authoritarianism is The Trial by Franz Kafka. Now this, I will concede, is a bit of an outlier from this list. It should also be noted that it was never completed by Kafka in his lifetime, and it was actually published by his friend after he died, I believe in 1925. So there's that. But unlike the rest of these authors, Kafka was writing before the Russian Revolution, before Stalinism, before Hitler, before the fascist party took control of Italy, before any of these catastrophes of the 20th century unfolded. And yet somehow he saw something coming. The Trial is not exactly a totalitarian kind of dystopian novel, but it fundamentally is really a novel about terrifying bureaucracy. A man is arrested for an unspecified crime by officials who barely understand the system themselves. Right? At first, the novel, it feels really kind of absurd and funny in some ways. When you're looking at the individual, you have these incompetent officials and this crazy opaque procedure, and everything feels irrational and mundane. But reading Kafka after the events of the 20th century, this sheds a completely different light on the novel. Because 20 years later, that same bureaucratic system, that same mentality that is funny with Joseph K., it's no longer funny. It becomes transport lists, labor classifications, state files, and millions of people dead in death camps. Reading Kafka feels surreal, which is part of why I love him, but sometimes he also feels unnervingly prophetic. So absolutely read this at your own caution. What unnerves me most about Kafka is precisely that he was not consciously writing about totalitarianism in the way Orwell or Kessler were. All of this kind of raises a very interesting and disturbing question, which is, what did Kafka see in human nature that really caused him to write the way that he did? Because it was very unique at that time, and it remains unique today. It feels to me, at least, as though he understood something probably before anyone else, which is that, among other things, how impersonal systems can really become monstrous and murderous, precisely because nobody inside them takes or feels any personal responsibility. So in conclusion here, 1984, still absolutely worth reading, especially because of its brilliant focus on language. The whole surveillance thing is interesting, I guess, but far more interesting is Orwell's explanation of the power of word control, right? Something sometimes what we think of as right think or political correctness. The idea is, if you cannot speak an idea, eventually you may not even be able to think the idea. To me, that insight alone really makes this novel permanently important. But 1984 is also not the only way to understand the modern, suffocating, constricting tyranny that we live in. And these other books, they explore dimensions Orwell barely touches on. Bureaucracy, ideology, mass conformity, comfort, revolutionary fanaticism, I guess that's also in 1984, and the fragility of truth. So if you're interested in understanding the control of tyrannical states, I highly recommend checking out some of these books. I'm sure there are many others, But I hope you got something out of this video. Please do like, comment, subscribe. It really means the world to me. And so what's the parting message for today? Stay free and happy reading.